All right, here we go. Kinesiology 223. This is chapter 24. We're talking about aggression in sports still. And this is presentation 3. Now, I have to tell you, this is a pretty beefy presentation. It's got like 16 slides to it. So I might make this into presentation number 3A and 3B because I just don't think I'm going to get through all 16. I'm going to try to break it maybe at 8 slides and 8 slides. Let's see how this goes. All right, so if we jump on into this, we're going to be on page 603. And within the context, they talk about these different reasons for aggression in sport. And we've talked a little bit in terms of, for example, the environment itself and also things that are specific to the person. And really what we're talking about here as we get into this, I'm going to read this passage from the book. The other important issues including spectators and aggression, verbal and abusive leadership and coaches, peer aggression, game reasoning and aggression, moral disengagement and aggression, athletic injuries and aggression, physical and neural bases of aggression, athletic performance and aggression, team morale, etc. So if you look at this and kind of go down the list and parse this out, the types of aggression they're listing are spectators, verbal, peer, game reasoning, moral disengagement, athletic injuries, physical and neural bases, athletic performance, team morale, sport specific, etc., gender, cultural, and alcohol. So if we go ahead and go through this, spectators, the major categories of this are like assault, fighting, and depending what stadium you go to and what jersey you're wearing, you could be fighting in the stands, for God's sakes. Verbal abuse, you might have people run onto the field, people throwing things onto the field, and acts of terrorism itself. Now, I have to tell you that I too am guilty of perhaps heckling an outfielder from another team. I've done that at a Cubs game, but it's kind of what everybody did in the right field bleachers. I'm not rationalizing it as a means of being part of the crowd or rationalizing as part of like the crowd behavior, but I can tell you it's just something that's been widely accepted and something that's always been done. Now, in terms of fighting and fighting in terms of like the players fighting, that's different. Assault, fighting, verbal abuse, and then you get into field invasion of people running onto the field or throwing objects. That's a totally different animal. Assault, now you can have physical assault, and you have to think of this in terms of how would that actually happen if the person stayed in the stands and the participants stayed on the field or on the basketball court, etc. But there have been situations where you have individuals like, for example, I think it was Monica Seles. She was a tennis player where an individual ran down from the stands and stabbed her in the back with a steak knife. And it's kind of somewhat mind-boggling that that could actually happen, right? But it could happen where you have somebody who's not mentally stable, perhaps they have some other issues, and they end up taking it out on a player, or perhaps they have a certain affinity for another player and they take it out on that player's opponent, right? So there's different ways to kind of view this. But when you have vandalism and terrorism, I don't really elaborate too much into the terrorism side of it, but one can think through in terms of like different terrorist activities and how that could propagate itself within a field or within a stadium. When they go into this a little bit more, they talk about, moreover, watching some violent contact sports actually increase spectators' readiness to be aggressive. And I would say yes to a certain degree, but I would think that most of the individuals who are watching aggressive sports, like for example, if one goes to an MMA contest, the people who are in the stands are probably hardwired for that aggressive type of activity. And more than likely, many of them are probably skilled in one of different disciplines, many different disciplines that are part of MMA. And I cite an example and a reference where I went with one of my friends to a regional MMA show years ago now. We're talking at the initial starting point of MMA. But he was very much into it. I went with him. And it was one of those where you could just tell, you could look at people's ears and see that they had scrapped before. You can see that they were into fighting. You can see that they were into wrestling. And in that environment, you just didn't know who was the alpha dog. But I will say this, and I cite this because there was one point where I was just standing in line to use the washroom, and somebody walked by and they happened to inadvertently step on my foot. And this guy was big as a house. And he probably could have pile driven me into the ground if he wanted to. He turned and with great sincerity said, "Bro, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to step on your shoe. My apologies." And again, it's an example of in that environment which is clearly a highly aggressively charged environment because it's MMA, you just didn't know who was the alpha dog in the room. And I've never felt like a bigger badass in my life, let me tell you. But the point is, here's this person who was completely respectful, completely gentlemanly, and very apologetic for doing something that was clearly an accident. And again, I push back on the book here and saying there's a readiness to be aggressive. I would say there's a readiness to be aggressive when you have perhaps fans in the stands who are watching an aggressive sport, but they don't actually understand the physical outcome of aggressive behavior. Just saying. I think there's a line that can be drawn in the sand when you get into fans of MMA. Just want to point it out. So with spectators, factors that can influence violence, that can be, if you have younger spectators, more disadvantaged male spectators, if your team is a losing team, if there's big rivalries. I mean, you even see it like in the draft when, I think it was Clay Matthews got up in front of the draft and it was Ray announced the pick for the Packers, and he's like, the Bears still suck. There's a rivalry between the Chicago Bears and Green Bay that is forever. And you have these rivalries in sports that kind of manifest out of nothing other than your proximity to the actual team you're rooting for. And it's just silly, but it is what it is. So the thing is, when you look at these, and you look at this list over here of different reasons why you might have aggressive behavior, and you look at like the list that they provide between these bullet points here or this last one, boom, it becomes a conversation of like, how do you intervene? Or as perhaps somebody who might become a manager of a facility, how do you intervene? And you see this in soccer, where in Europe, the teams that hate each other for no other reason than their proximity to the team itself, the fans hate each other for their proximity to the team itself. When they go to a stadium, they have different entrances. They have different seating areas. They have barriers in between the seating areas. And yet, despite that, they still throw stuff at each other over the barriers itself. So you, as a facilities manager, may have to come up with ways to mitigate some of that aggressiveness. And it's not perfect. It's not Pollyanna, but I'm just saying, when you have a highly charged environment like that, it could have a facilitating effect on aggression overall in the stands, but can also have aggression overall on the field of play. Now, when they talk about kids down here in the last little part, parents, parents should also educate their children about the purpose of sport and the inappropriateness of witnessing aggressive acts as a source of enjoyment. And there's a lot to be said for that in terms of the socialization of violence, like we talked about in a previous presentation with the hockey players, and how it's rewarded in Americanized hockey, but it's not rewarded in European style hockey. Now, sports managers and administrators should be apprised of these findings to help them decrease the probability of violence by eliminating sales of alcohol, enforcing strict seating capacities, minimize crowd density, also separating crowds from different factions. Coaches and players should maintain emotional control on the field and ensure they are not triggers for fan aggression, yet part of the process of being an athlete. Sometimes the athletes buy into the persona of being an aggressor or being a triggers for the fans. Another story. They should educate children on the purpose of sport, etc., and being an enjoyable process. With verbal aggression, they talk about verbally abusive coaches. They're like less competent in terms of how they're perceived. Abusive coaching was related to increased player aggression and decreased task performance. And I think we've talked about this numerous times. But the thing you're really looking at is when you have a highly charged coach, maybe like a Bobby Knight, who's very famous for this style of coaching from years ago, um, would be somewhat polarizing now, but back in the day, he was somebody that was basically the tip of the spear for aggressive behavior at the University of Indiana, and then when he went on to, I believe it was Texas Tech. And you have a coach that's really driving the culture of the aggressive behavior. Again, aggressiveness is okay, but if it's something where it becomes deleterious or you have this negative effect of the aggressive behavior, or it becomes abusive by the coach, that's when it crosses a line. And unfortunately, that's what happened with Bobby Knight. He crossed the line with one of his players. For peer aggression, in a study of over 6,000 young people, for example, Stafford and Associates found that most physical harm in the context of sport took place between young people themselves in the form of bullying. This result is especially alarming, alarming given the findings of an interview of 98 volunteer youth coaches who were unable to accurately estimate the extent of peer aggression. Now, I would say that's the fault of the coach, because the coach should have their thumb on the pulse of the team and know that there's bullying afoot. And I've seen it even in youth football, and it becomes a situation where you have to intervene on behalf of the other student, the other athlete, and find a way for that athlete to assert themselves and find a positive feedback loop for that young athlete. Otherwise, it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy where then they will have negative performance. The negative performance will be met by bullying, will be met by ridicule from their teammates, which leads to more negative performance. So it's a matter of creating a virtuous cycle, and I say that all the time. All right, so if we look at moral disengagement, aggression itself, it can have a moral barometer to it. And with moral disengagement and aggression, MDA, it's one of the self-regulating tools that athletes have when they realize that this is correct or this is incorrect behavior. But if you have a child who's an athlete, or a child in general who has difficulty with moral disengagement and aggressive behavior, they will probably be aggressive on the field of play. And there has to be some interventions in place between the parents as well, the parents and the coaches, to be able to minimize what is in essence either a rationalization or a justification for the aggressive behavior of the athlete. So in one of the studies, they found that this disengagement was relevant to the players, and they gave either a justification for the clip they saw or displacement of responsibility to the others. They didn't take ownership of the actual aggressive behavior. And this is something that's a cultural thing that you can teach your athletes to be able to be more involved and engaged in their own behavior, but also more self-aware of their own behavior as it relates to other people. And this, in terms of this moral disengagement, is it's found to be associated with coach justification of aggression. So again, the moral ambiguity that you see and the lack of moral barometer can be seen in the athletes, but it can also be seen in the coach itself. And when you have a coach who really has a disassociation or has a general moral ambiguous mindset, you'll end up having a coach who's probably more aggressive, and you'll probably have a team of athletes who are also probably more aggressive, to the point of being morally disengaged from proper behavior. I got 1 minute left down here, so I'm going to go ahead and try to get through this slide, and then I'll break off to the next presentation. With athletic injuries, the book source is information to correlate that aggression causes injuries. They cite research specific to hockey players that include tripping penalties, etc., from behind to cause harm. Now, there's a court case that went through court years ago about a hockey player who was playing against another player, and they were scrappy the whole time. And after the end whistle or the horn blew, player A cross-checked player B and cross-checked him into the boards and paralyzed athlete number B. And so it ended up being a spinal cord injury. And the court case referenced, was it in the context of play, or because it was after the horn, was it not in the context of play? It's a pretty well-known case, and it's one I'm sure you can look up. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and break off from here and go to the next presentation.